Emotions are your P&L. It's like how much money you made or lost in your brain. But where we have some control, and this is where, to answer your question directly, is not our thoughts, but our response to our thoughts.
This is Running for Real, the podcast for runners who know that for every runner's high, there are just as many lows. All those just missed PRs, easy runs that feel hard, injury blues, and more. Each week, we'll talk to running, health, and wellness experts about their highs, lows, and best advice to build our confidence. Running for Real is about being honest, being brave, and most of all, not feeling alone. And now here's our host, who has a scar on her big toe, Tina Muir.
Hello, my friends. Welcome to episode number 124 of the Running for Real podcast. Thank you so much for joining me today. On this 7th episode, you've heard me in a row. We're on day 7 of our mental training week. And yesterday we had the wonderful Carla Maya on the show, and she gave a bit of a different perspective. For us, she wasn't traditionally a runner and kind of got sucked into it by the work she was doing, which was really interesting to hear. And she also gave us some different advice coming at it from more of a researcher's perspective. So I hope you enjoyed that one. Yesterday, I also talked about ads and why I put so much thought into them. I know ads can be really annoying, but I try to bring on companies that I believe are doing good, not just with their products, but what they're doing to make the world a better place. I won't go into it again, I promise, but I just wanted to say thank you to those of you who went out yesterday, and there was a lot of you, and purchased a product from one of the brands sponsoring this episode. By you purchasing those products, the ones that I recommend, using the links I give you, just to kind of explain that, you're really giving me a huge leg up. So thank you so much for doing that. Now, today is day 7 on this 7 episodes in 7 days for this week of mental training. And I'm really excited for this one. This guy is big time. And I had to get Guy Winch, do you remember him from episode 92, to introduce us, but I'm so glad he did. They are both awesome guys, and I've actually kind of organized that when I am hoping to go to New York a little later this year, I will be able to meet up with them both, which would be so exciting. But before I tell you a little bit more about Jonathan and why he's the person I wanted to wrap up this week with, I want to introduce you to our sponsors. So I want to thank Body Health and Generation UCAN for sponsoring these episodes of the podcast. Body Health, who have been with me from the start of the Running for Real podcast and will always be there to help me recover from whatever I'm working through at the time. I'm always pushing myself in one way or another, and I know you are too. You work hard, and it's okay. Body Health Perfect Amino is the perfect ally to help you handle all the stresses, the soreness of training while you go about this craziness of life. So you can go to tinamuir.com/aminos. That's TINAMUIR.com/AMINOS. For more information, you will find it there and you can go get yourself some. I also want to thank Generation UCAN for supporting this episode of the podcast. As you know, they fueled me through Boston and every day in the build-up. They also set up and hosted the amazing live show with Lindsay, Ali, and Carrie. This is a great company. Talked about going after companies who are really doing good things, and they have great products. So go get yourself some powder that you can use in your next race or before it, and these UCAN bars that I eat every single day by visiting tinamuir.com/UCAN. That's TINAMUIR.com/UCAN. And later in the show, I'll tell you how you can get 25% off your first order, even if you have ordered Generation UCAN in the past. So stay tuned. Now, I said to you earlier that I was going to tell you a bit more about my guest. Now, my guest today is Jonathan Fader, who goes by Fader. You will see that I had a little bit of trouble. I've never been someone who is able to refer to people by their first names. You will hear about that. But Jonathan, or Fader, is the director of mental conditioning for the New York Giants, which is obviously an American football team. He's also the psychologist for the New York Mets, or was for 9 seasons. He's a performance and clinical psychologist, and he's known for his TEDx talk, which was all about kind of being in the moment and kind of appreciating our lives, something that we all need a little bit more of a reminder about. Now, I mentioned that Guy Winch introduced us, and he was the person that Guy recommended above all others of who he thought would be a great fit for the show. So I really thought he would be a fantastic kind of wrap up for this week. And I really hope you enjoy this episode with Fader or Jonathan. And let's get to it. Fader, welcome to the Running for Real podcast. Thank you so much for being here today.
Oh my God, it's so fun to be talking to you, Tina. And I really am excited about our conversation.
I'm excited about this, although I definitely felt a bit weird just saying Fader. For the listeners, he told me to call him that, but it just doesn't feel right. Like I've never been someone to call someone by their last names, and I'm struggling here.
Yeah, it's so funny. I mean, with your accent, it sounds even more cool. So I think I'm just going to have to try to imitate Fader. It's like it sounds even cooler when you say it. I can do it in
Fader. Well, I can do it American.
No. Wow, that was a good American accent. No, it sounds so much more regal when you say it. Yeah, it's funny. People do call me Jonathan, but most people call me Fader. I think it's sort of like just working in sports so much too. But
that's true.
My family calls my wife calls me Fader, and my mom calls my dad Fader too. So it's like I'm about ready to start calling my daughters Fader Jr., Fader the Third here.
Do they, if they were referring to you, I guess they'd still just say daddy, wouldn't they? No,
they just say Poppy.
Poppy. Okay.
All right. Well, they do look. There is an element of confusion though when they have to introduce me to someone else by my first name, or they they actually I think go towards Jonathan just because I guess it's more common or people understand it. But if all my closest friends call me Fader, it's funny.
Oh, I love that. Okay, so I've talked a little bit about your kind of accomplishments, what you do in the intro. So I don't want to spend our time talking about that, but. A performance and clinical psychologist. Now, for someone listening, the performance psychologist, most people will probably get, but what does being a clinical psychologist mean?
So, one of the interesting things that's happened in my life, and just I think in psychology in general, is that clinical psychology, I started off with a clinical psychology background. What that means is you're really thinking about diagnosing and treating certain kinds of conditions, or what is called in that field disorders, right? So it's taking someone who's functioning less than normal in some way, less than average, or having difficulty, struggling with a particular thing. And you're really working to help them get to a place where they can do their daily activities. So in other words, you're taking someone who might feel depressed, right? Sad. And you're helping them kind of get to a place where they feel like they can live their life, and the sadness either is less or doesn't impact them as much. Whereas the work I do now and have been doing for the past, say, 15 years is working with people that are doing good or great and helping them to get even better, right? So there's a kind of continuum of people who are really struggling to people who are doing excellent. And in clinical psychology, we focus on people who are doing average to not so great or even struggling. And in performance psychology, largely we're working with people that are doing okay or even great and getting them an extra 1% here and there. There are some times with runners, as we'll talk about, and the baseball players and the football players and the firefighters I've worked with, where there are people who are also struggling with some mental wellness issue, and that comes into play. But largely speaking, the people I'm working with are people that are doing excellent, and we're helping them to get a little bit better in some particular part of their performance, whether it's running or playing a sport or being an executive or being a firefighter.
I would love that. So let's focus on, for just a second, let's talk about being a firefighter. Now, my community, I'm sure we have plenty of firefighters out there, but we have one in particular who is, just key member of our team. So I'd love to, give a shout out to Eddie. But when you say about working with firefighters, like what does that involve? What kind of things are you working with them to do?
I have been really fortunate in my life. And I've had the opportunity, sometimes I actually think about myself not as a psychologist, but as an anthropologist, meaning, an anthropologist is someone who goes into a different culture, joins with that culture, understands what the dynamics are there. They're not from there, right? They don't live on that island. They don't do what those folks do. And obviously, I'm definitely not a firefighter, but I've had the opportunity really to say, I have something of value that we're doing in sports and high performance. And that's something that's been really of interest to people in firefighting because there are some parallels. And so I've had the tremendous opportunity of collaborating with a guy named Jason Bresler at FDNY, the fire department in New York City, which is one of the largest fire departments in the world. It's 11,000 people fighting fires in New York City. And so Jason, being a former Marine and having some experience as a baseball player in college, really became interested in what's going on in sports and started reaching out to people in the community and saying, in the sports psychology, performance psychology community, and saying, hey, what can we learn from there? What kind of skills are being employed both in sports and elite sports, but also in the military. And how can that help firefighters? Traditionally, Tina, firefighting, anything around the mental space for firefighters has been post-event, meaning something went wrong or there was a serious situation. And it's like helping firefighters to process what happened. But what's emerged in the past, say, 10 years, largely the work of Jason and others, is to help firefighters do the kind of mental training that athletes do. So to help them learn certain breathing techniques that are going to help them to remain calm and steady and focus in certain situations, to help them develop performance and tactical imagery. In other words, mental rehearsal of what they're going to do. Interesting dynamic, and I'm sure Eddie, if you're listening to this, you're the person related to your team. What firefighters experience that's an interesting performance challenge is that a lot of times you're only going to be deployed to working once every couple months, once every 6 months. There's some things in firefighting, for example, like a roof rope rescue that only occurs once a year. So in these situations, the question becomes, how do you practice for something that you're really only doing once a year? How do you get really, real, effective practice?
When you don't know when it's going to happen, right? Whereas like sports, you do know.
Sports, you do know. Yeah. But even in sports, right? Like even in sports, there's some roles or jobs in sports. Like if you're a marathon runner, like the marathon's coming up. Unless I get injured, I'm going to that marathon. But if you're a reliever in baseball, in other words, you're a pitcher that comes in the late innings, you really don't know when you're going to perform or how you're going to perform. If you're a kicker in American football, similarly, you don't really know how it's going to go down. And the more, and we could talk about this with regard to running, certainly, but one of the biggest elements in performance psychology is uncertainty and the management of uncertainty. I mean, as humans, we really don't like uncertainty, and it interferes with our ability to perform. And so a lot of what we do is creating more certainty in uncertain environments and creating mental systems for people to allow themselves to deal with uncertainty and metabolize uncertainty.
That's really interesting and definitely makes sense. And particularly, you being in New York and working with the New York Fire Department, I mean, I'm sure that everyone's mind has kind of gone to, September 11th and thought about they would have been heavily involved in that. I'm sure there was a lot, to kind of work through after that. I'm not sure if you were working with them then, but it probably, was a real point where they realized we need to kind of help people deal with things afterwards. So you being in New York, I think kind of brings it home a lot more. So thank you for sharing that with us. And thank you for doing that with them. Like that's wonderful.
I feel I should thank them, honestly. I feel I should thank them. Sure. I mean, it's like, that work, to me, I'm very much, I take my work seriously and I love it. And I feel it's such a privilege to work with people who are marathon runners or people who are athletes on world stages. I just, one of the things is as you were pointing out, the results of excellent performance or average performance in firefighting are so much more catastrophic or amazing and miraculous. So it's just, I actually do that whenever I go give a presentation to that group, which is, frequent. I thank them.
Well, we can take a moment to thank them here and all the people who work in public service like that to keep us safe. So thank you. All right. So on that note, this is slightly on that topic, but one thing that you're really passionate about, you talked a lot about it in your TEDx talk, was about how you believe everyone can kind of reach their most elite selves. Everyone can be better, be their best. Now, this is a constant battle I am fighting with the rest of the running world, trying to convince them that, yes, elite runners do all have sports psychologists and people they work with, but that doesn't mean that you have to be at a certain level to be kind of treated that way and to work on these things. So tell us a bit about why you feel passionately about that and what it is you would like to say to anyone listening who thinks, well, I'm not good enough to be working on my kind of mental game.
Well, one of the things I think about is that, well, this is sort of an unrelated idea, but I'll just tell you this story that a lot of my sense of performance improvement comes from a very unusual source, which is, growing up, my mom actually had a resume writing business. And what that meant is that, so basically what that meant was she, was sort of like a stay-at-home mom, but she was a writer and she'd worked in advertising and she wanted to keep busy and keep her mind fresh. She was super creative, still is. And so she started this business resume writing, meaning she would just put up ads in the supermarket. And here in New York City, she would get a ton of people. This is pre-internet, right? So I don't want to date myself, everyone, but you get the vibe of what years we're talking about. And, she would get a ton of people that would come and ask her to write their resume. And as a kid, I remember, getting put to bed. I put that in quotes because I wasn't really sleeping. And I would kind of walk down the hall and I would listen to my mom interview these people about their lives. And they would tell their story in the most self-deprecating, the most, pointing out the things in their life and pointing out all these gaps in employment, which we've all had, and moments of failure. And I would just listen to my mom rewrite their story. And I would just listen to my mom say, hey, here's a way that you could change how you think about yourself. And it really set me up, luckily, from a young age to think about human potential. And I think in my mind, our biggest limitation for how we can improve is the idea that we can't improve.
Thank you to my friends at Generation You Can for sponsoring this episode of the Running for Real podcast. A few weeks ago, when I ran the Indy Mini, somehow I left my You Can peanut butter bar in my room, which I intended on being my pre-race just kind of snack. I knew I couldn't make it through this run without something, so I started to panic. I walked down to Starbucks and they did not accept Starbucks card that I had on my phone or use Apple Pay. And of course I didn't have my wallet, so no Cliff Bar then. I decided I had one choice that would be to take the race fuel, and I took a gel around 10 miles. Let's just say I did not enjoy that decision. I had to choke it down. And you literally have to kind of gasp for breath in between chewing. Is that the right word? I don't know if it's chewing. It's more like kind of trying to convince your body you need to swallow this lump of goo. And I missed my UCAN so much on that day. I wasn't planning on taking the powder during the race, but I certainly would have taken the powder before, along with my bar, had I not forgotten them. It made me really thankful. I've finally found a product for me that works. It never upsets my stomach, and I know very, very few people who have ever had issues with it. And it tastes good too. You can get 25% off your order by using code TinaMuir25. Even if you've purchased Generation You Can before, this is an exclusive offer, so go use it, TinaMuir25 at tinamuir.com/youcan, and go take the most of that offer. Go enjoy it and you will not regret it. I absolutely love my UCAN and I have a feeling you will too.
And I would kind of walk down the hall and I would listen to my mom interview these people about their lives. And they would tell their story in the most self-deprecating, the most, pointing out the things in their life and pointing out all these gaps in employment, which we've all had, and, moments of failure. And I would just listen to my mom rewrite their story. And I would just listen to my mom say, hey, here's a way that you could change how you think about yourself. And it really set me up, luckily, from a young age to think about human potential. And I think in my mind, our biggest limitation for how we can improve is the idea that we can't improve. Mm-hmm. And that once you get past that, a sense of, well, not if I can improve or if I can't, but how could I if I was going to? What small action could I take? And the thing, I'm in the same struggle as you. I work all the time to help people realize that. The interesting thing about it, though, is I feel that people really have to realize that by doing. It's really hard to convince someone that they can grow. And so for those of you that are listening out there, I'd say, you're sort of asking me this question, Tina, but my thought about it is, and it's a tough one, is, what could you do to experiment? Forget about whether Tina's right or wrong or Fader's right or wrong. What could you do to experiment, to test it? Let's say it was a science project, right? And you were testing whether you could get better. Mm-hmm. What would you do to test if you could get a little bit better using a technical thing that you're getting from someone like you, Tina, or more of something that's about your mental strength and flexibility? How could you experiment to test the theory if you could get better, rather than to spend time thinking about on a kind of intellectual level if you can?
So you mean like taking something like self-talk and saying, I'm gonna try and watch, or not maybe stop them coming in, but try and take the thoughts that I have that are negative and, talk to myself in a kinder way, kind of reframe them in a kinder way, and I'll see if it works, see if it helps me. Is that kind of what you mean?
Absolutely. So if we're talking purely about mental conditioning, which is how we've come to talk about the use of sport and performance psychology techniques, this idea that, we're conditioning our body, but what are we doing to really do strength and flexibility training for our mind or our brain, or the connection between our body and the other part of our being, right, which is what manages it. And, people really debate about where the mind begins and the body starts. But certainly on our mental state, what if I was going to do one thing? So the thing you're talking about is self-talk. Yeah. What if all I did over the next, like I'm training for a marathon, right? Like, what if all I did was just kept track of my thoughts before, during, and after my running? That's all I did. Like, I just had a little journal, and all I did was I just wrote down, like, okay, before I start running, here's what I'm thinking. Here's what I'm running when I'm thinking. These are the thoughts I'm having. And then afterwards, in firefighting and other contexts, we call this preparation, execution, and reflection. What if I just had those three stages to my workout? I just had a prep phase where I just was aware of what thoughts I had. And then I had a execution phase where I thought about what was happening during my running. And then afterwards, a reflection phase. That I think for many people leads to them to realize that you're actually having dozens, sometimes hundreds of thoughts. Some of them are really counterproductive. You also kind of took us into this interesting area, which is like how much of that can be changed. We could have a whole conversation about that, because I'm of the belief that a lot of our thoughts aren't to be changed; they're just to be acknowledged and let go of. But there are several different. I mean, there's a million, but several different known strategies for, as you say, responding to self-messaging or self-talk.
And I want to go into some of those in just a second. But as you brought it up, so you said about, a lot of them, you kind of just, these thoughts are going to come in and they're going to pass through. I've heard people referring to it as like a cloud passing in the sky. It's there. You recognize that it's there, but then it's gone. So, we do hear a lot of kind of contradicting things from maybe people who do know what they're talking about. Maybe they don't, saying you can control your thoughts. You can't control your thoughts. It can be a bit overwhelming. So what would be your kind of summary based on what you have kind of researched and learned about, the thoughts that we have? And we hear that, is it 85% of our thoughts are supposedly negative? Or is it 60 to 80% or somewhere around there? Like, what have been your findings for people who do kind of struggle with feeling like they're all negative?
Yeah, so if I can, with your permission, I'll just take like one step back.
Yep, sure.
From that. And the way I explain it to anyone, athlete, business person, firefighter, is I say, in my view, there are kind of three components to the human experience: actions, emotions, and thoughts. Actions, emotions, and then thoughts. And so when I ask most people, like, okay, what do you feel like you spend the most time on? They'll usually say emotion. Like, that's the thing that takes, well, not the most time on, but that's the thing that gets in our way or that provides the most satisfying feeling, right? It's the loudest. Most of the people say they spend the most time around their thoughts, right? So like, and if you really think about it, though, the thing that you control the most are your actions.
Yeah.
Right. So you have, in my mind, very little control, direct control over your emotions. Emotions are like a dependent variable. They're an outcome. They're like the profit and loss of your brain business, right? That's just sort of like what happens, right? That's what emotions are, your P&L. It's like how much money you made or lost in your brain, just sort of what happens. But where we have some control, and this is where, to answer your question directly, is not our thoughts, but our response to our thoughts. And so that's where I draw the distinction with the people I work with. It's like, you can't control your thoughts. Your thoughts are just like this weird random number generator sometime. And you don't control your thoughts, but you certainly control your interpretations of your thoughts. For example, if one of the things that you decide to do is just to say, that's interesting that I just had that thought, it kind of changes your relationship to that.
So
if every time you have a thought, you say, well, that's not going to be along for very long. Like, that's just passing as this cloud. Sometimes what I use is I use the analogy of, you're a gatekeeper and there are kind of people passing by the gate, right? And, you're watching them pass by the gate. No one's really there very long. right? They're just kind of things passing by, or train cars passing by, right? You're just kind of watching them go by. So those ideas, which are rooted in mindfulness and acceptance and commitment type treatments and therapies, those are all super powerful. But really what it comes down to is your action, right? So what do you do? In other words, let's use a very simple example of like a social example that we all feel. Everyone listening on our podcast today, everybody who's really alive has moments where you felt weird in a social situation. Maybe you felt overwhelmed by the amount of people. Maybe you felt like if you're like me, you've said something ridiculous and trying to take it back. You forget someone's name.
Or danced on a TED Talk in the middle of the stage.
There you go. If you see me dance on a TED Talk, man, I've got so much. I've got I'm still getting strife for that.
Wait, can I pause on that? Did you practice that, or did you?
No, I'm actually upset. See, this is the really interesting thing. I practiced my TED Talk a ton. In fact, I got a coach. I had a coach who came in and coached me. I was thinking like, who could help me? So I got a comedy improv coach who helped me fine tune things. And I'm very big on coach. I believe everybody should have a coach. Yeah. If you're doing anything that involves performance, you should have a coach, which is why I love, the things that you're doing in terms of running and marathoning, et cetera. What I think about is I wish I like practice the dance more. I didn't even think about it. And I guess in a way it came off okay because it was more sort of authentic, but I wish I had practiced the dance more.
No, I think that adds to it. I think that's amazing because that means that like you were just, as you were talking about in the moment, like just doing what felt natural, whereas otherwise you might have been like a bit more like mechanical, like thinking about it. So I think that actually brings home the whole point of the talk. And I will put links in the show notes to everyone listening so you can go watch it. But I think it's so much better that you didn't practice. I was just curious. So obviously you are a very good like natural dancer because, you had some moves there.
Hey, listen, I'm going to be sending everybody to this podcast for many reasons, but one of them will be that you said I'm a good dancer. So if like one of my friends wants to beef with me, I'll just send them back to this link.
Okay, sounds good. They'll be like go to minute. What would this be? Like 20 something.
I go to minute 22nd where my dancing is endorsed. Forget about sport and performance psychology. I just got to get people to stand up for me as a dancer.
Although, unfortunately, getting that, I stopped you in your train of thought, which was you were talking about, doing something that makes you uncomfortable. I don't know if you remember what you were saying.
Yeah, I do. So really, what I was saying was, in these social situations, a lot of times we just drill down on our emotions. In other words, we think, oh, I'm feeling this way. I got to stop feeling this way. And that just sort of makes it worse. Or we have a thought like, oh, man, these people think I'm fill in the blank, shy. They think I'm ridiculous. They think I'm weird, whatever it is. And those things you don't control as much as just saying, you know what? Let me just listen to this person. That's what I'm going to focus on. Or, you know what? Let me just focus on saying this one thing. Or, you know what? I'm going to kind of restart this process by walking to the other side of the party. And those same things occur in every performance space, right? You have control to some degree of where you put your attention, right? And so even in a painful experience, like I work with a lot of, people like you who are, elite runners. And I talk about, well, where are we putting our attention when we experience the pain, right? Are we just drilling down into the pain and reminding ourselves about it? Or are we putting our attention on looking for breaks in the pain? Because every kind of pain has breaks in it. They might not be enough to get full relief, but it just changes your perspective when you notice that. You have a way of shifting your focus. Like right now, I'm totally drilled into, the sound of your voice. But if I take a second, I can actually draw my focus, and everybody listening too can draw their focus to where their feet are on the floor. Right. And so if you're listening to this, you could just take your attention right now. You were listening intently to this conversation, hopefully. I'm sure you were, given the great questions. But if you just take your attention and place it where your feet are touching the floor, all of a sudden you've shifted how you feel in the moment. And with practice, that becomes a more internalized skill.
Which is something that I think many of my listeners are trying to work on. It's kind of the in thing right now. I don't know if you've kind of felt that or if it's just one of those things when you are aware of it, you see it. But, being mindful, being, as you talked about in your TED Talk, in the moment, trying to not just let life pass you by as you're trying to multitask, something I'm working on but have struggled with a lot. So before we get to these main questions, on that note, is there anything you would like to say to listeners just to kind of make your case for that, kind of this working towards being fully in a conversation, not thinking about what you're going to respond and say, while they're still talking, or being fully in the moment, being fully in the present. Anything you would like to add? I know that's kind of a loaded question, but if you could just give one or two things you'd like to say before we get to these main questions.
Well, I'll say two. I have lots of things. I realize that we're only on for 45 minutes or an hour, so I don't want to monopolize. But that's such a great question, and as I said, I really believe that the question is, what would happen if you tried it, right? So more than anything that I can say, I'm a firm believer people are experts on themselves, and so I can certainly point you to the direction of evidence for how powerful these kind of techniques can be. For example, I have a colleague who coordinated the whole psychological skills program for the Navy SEALs, and they've sent Navy SEALs into combat with these techniques and found that the ones that had these techniques really did so much better in terms of their ability to manage stress, both in deployment and then coming back. And these findings were substantiated by also looking at brain imaging afterwards and seeing that there were some brain changes associated with that. So there's something really powerful going on when we talk about the idea of, forget about naming it as mindfulness, just purely learning how to slow things down and learning how to have a different relationship with yourself in the present moment and getting present.
Thank you to Body Health for sponsoring this episode of the Running for Real podcast. This longtime supporter of me and Running for Real has allowed me to feel good on my run for years, as Perfect Amino contains the 8 essential amino acids that the body needs to support and maintain its muscular, skeletal, enzymatic, that's such a hard word to say, and hormonal systems. The essential amino acids in Perfect Amino are in the exact proportions needed for maximum utilization by our body. What does that mean, you're wondering? Perfect Amino is an amino acid supplement that is 99% utilized by the body to make protein, whereas protein in meat or eggs might be utilized by up to 50%. Quite a big difference there. If you're still confused, you can find out more information by visiting tinamuir.com/aminos to learn more and also get 10% off your order of everything on the Body Health website, and they have a lot of awesome products for a healthy and sound body, especially if you're coming at health from a holistic standpoint, and that's really important to you. They have a lot of stuff I think you might be interested in. Now back to Perfect Amino. It absorbs quickly and you can just get on with your day knowing that you have got this recovery process going. You can get 10% off your order by visiting tinamuir.com/aminos. That's tinamuir.com/aminos. And thank you so much for showing Body Health. We appreciate them by your order.
They've sent Navy SEALs into combat with these techniques and found that the ones that had these techniques really did so much better in terms of their ability to manage stress, both in deployment and then coming back. And these findings were substantiated by also looking at brain imaging afterwards and seeing that there were some brain changes associated with that. So there's something really powerful going on when we talk about the idea of, forget about naming it as mindfulness, just purely learning how to slow things down and learning how to have a different relationship with yourself in the present moment and getting present. So, I mean, I think from my perspective, the things I do, I do a practice every day where I just focus on my breath. Simple as that. I really like some of the apps like Headspace and Calm, but more than anything else, like if I'm in the moment to use, I really like what you said about listening. I have to remind myself to do that. Like so when you're talking, sometimes I think like, what does Tina really want to talk about? Like,
because I'm really long-winded and rambly. That is probably the reason.
Not at all. Not at all. I mean, I think like, no, because of me, because I'm thinking like, I want to say this. And just to your point, I always, when I'm talking to coaches, what I say is like, there are 2 ways to listen. One is to understand, the other is to reply. Simple as that. And so it's very hard for us as humans to do the one where we're listening to understand, whether it's in our personal relationships or romantic relationships, in parenting, as a coach, as a learner, as someone who's being coached. It's really difficult to listen to understand, as you pointed out. And so I have all kinds of, to use your word, self-talk. I mean, sometimes I just tell myself, shut up, Fader. I literally say it to myself, shut up. Because, of my if my daughters are talking to me and I'm just turning into one of those kind of like authoritarian tiger parents, I just have to remind myself to, just like slow down and see opportunities that wouldn't be there if I was really just listening to reply all the time.
That's so true. Thank you for explaining that as well, because I think that is something that we are all very guilty of doing, kind of wanting to get your point back again and not truly listening. I'm definitely trying to work on that a lot right now. All right.
How do you do that? Like, so how do you work on it? Like when you have those moments where you're listening and you realize that, oh, maybe you're not listening.
I think it's the same as you. It's like, stop. Like, this person has something either they feel is important, like that it's important to them to like tell you this, or it is important what they're saying and you should listen. Not like, to be honest, I definitely feel like I've picked it up from my dad, and I'm sure he won't mind me saying this, but my dad is a bit of a know-it-all. And so he's always kind of, my sister and I both tend to do that kind of, and we'll be ready with that response as soon as someone finishes what they're saying. So I think a lot of it is similar to you, kind of saying, stop it, like let them finish what they want to say. And Brene Brown talks about this a lot. I know my listeners know I'm like in love with Brene Brown, but
literally, I mean, like, she's the woman. I think she has more like lovers. I know how her husband feels about all this, because she's got probably more people in love with her right now than anyone on the planet.
I know, she's amazing. But she talks about how, like, she was the one that really made me realize, like, you got to stop and think and let people finish what they're saying. And then it's okay to pause a second and like think about your answer. So I'm trying, but it's not easy, like you said. But for me, I'm still in the like, shut up, Tina phase. So I'll see when I get further along. Okay, I want to get to these main questions, as this is kind of the primary focus for this week. So if someone has a big race coming up, you mentioned a marathon, it could be a marathon, a half marathon, a 10K, whatever, and they have decided, right, I want to work on my mental toughness. I want to do some mental training. I want to get my mind ready for this race. Maybe you could give us 2 to 3 things they could start working on about 3 months before this race is coming up.
Well, I'll just say, to me, Tina, I think the thing, and I wrote a lot about this in my book, Life is Sport. I think the thing that people on a macro level get confused about is the role of enjoyment in their preparation. And so fundamentally, my belief is that I think, I can't remember even who said it, but I think there's a famous golfer who said it, but it's really difficult to be good at something that you don't enjoy, especially with an endurance sport, which requires, sometimes 6 months of preparation or 3 months of preparation, depending on, how avid or how frequent you're competing. People really forget that. And so what I think about is, globally, how can you discover in yourself, if you think about an enjoyment as a continuous variable, what could you do to create more enjoyment in your overall preparation? So for example, what I mean is, like, what could you do every day to have a gratitude practice about it, or to observe something on every training day that brought you joy or intrigue? I think that my philosophical bent, and this sort of goes beyond performance psychology, is that, hey, we're so focused on this end game of, our PR, or, like what our time was or how we do at the wall, or what, all these things, that sometimes we lose sight of the fact that we're doing this at a fundamental level for either self-actualization or transcendence. And to bring that into every race, a lot of times we're not thinking about that, because we're just like worried about like our nipples being shaved off or whatever it is, like, and like the things that we do to take care of ourselves or our time or whatever it is. But if we can bring that in the global sense into our preparation, I think it makes the things that I'm about to talk about in terms of like the technical aspects of mental conditioning make more sense. So, if I have a global value in my life of how creating order and beauty will help me to set a better example for my kids and create a sense of a peaceful home that they'll carry through their life, making my bed is like a non-issue. Like if that's my global value and I'm enjoying that and thinking about that, then like the little small things I've got to do doesn't make a difference. Like, oh, of course I'm going to do that. And so I think similarly for someone who's serious about their running, if you can come up with kind of like a mission statement about why I'm doing this and how to enjoy it. And a mission statement, some of the runners I do actually do that. I have them write like a 1 or 2 sentence thing about like, this is why I'm doing this. And I'm not saying why you should do it. Like, it's up to you. Like, maybe you do this because, for you, it's the only time, like when you run a marathon or when you're running to a point where you're really pushing yourself, it's the only time you feel alive. Maybe it's because there's a certain sense of identity for you of being able to be the kind of person that can best yourself. Maybe it's about being part of a community. Like many people listening on to you here now are part of a community, and that's what it is. But if you can make that more conscious for yourself and bring that into everything, then all the small steps I'm going to talk about. So just to summarize, I think about it as kind of, there's a macro routine and a micro routine. And the macro routine is what you're doing globally. Like some of the things I just said. Do you have a sense of purpose about why you run? How deep is that purpose? How explicit is it? Do other people who are important to you know it and know it on a deep level, right? How genuine and authentic can you get so that the loved ones in your life, your kids, your parents, your boyfriend, your girlfriend, your partner, whoever it is, your friend, they know like why you run on a deep level. Do you know? And what are you doing every day to bring it in? That's kind of the macro. And then the micro, which, I'm happy to talk about any aspect of it, are the specific kind of mental skills that you're deploying in the moment, right? As I said, preparation, execution, and reflection. During these 3 phases of running, of marathons, of triathlons, of all the things you might be doing, what are the skills you're doing to help you to have the most access to your talents?
I love that. Maybe if you could give us, 1 or 2 of those that you maybe either think would be most powerful for runners or just have enjoyed using yourself in running or not.
Well, I think the most powerful one I would say for, if we just think about marathons or kind of longer runs, marathons or ultra marathons or triathlons, things like that, is getting good at a technique that almost everybody uses to some extent, which is called segmenting. Most runners at any elite level, even if they don't know they're doing it, are doing something called segmenting, which is kind of breaking it up into smaller groups. In other words, rather than like, if you think about 26 miles, you're like, oh yeah, like no matter who you are, or forget about that. If you think about mile 18 or mile 19 or wherever most people hit that kind of mental and physical wall, it seems like a lot. So most people are doing some level of segmenting, Tina. I don't know if that's something you do, breaking it up into smaller pieces in your mind.
Oh, yeah. I actually, this will be interesting to tell it to you. I've never told this to a psychologist, actually, other than my own. I do a thing, what I call mental bottles. My audience know about this, where every time you take on fuel, like your gels, or for me, it's Generation You Can, I then think like that's like switch. Okay, time to switch to a new person who I'm thinking about, or a new mantra or something. Like I use this example all the time. So mile 15 through 18 is my sports psychologist, because for me, that's the mental time when I've got a long way to go. 18 to 21 is my strength training coach, because that's when my form starts to break down. The next 21 to 24 is my husband and also my coach. And then the last bit is for me. So yeah, I definitely do that. But I kind of, every time I take the fuel, that's me mentally and physically switching to the next segment. So yeah.
That's awesome. That's actually, in my mind, the way I would classify that is the combination of 2 techniques. One is called segmenting. The other is called tethering, where you take a certain behavior or situation and you combine it. So you learn, this is what I'm supposed to do. And how many marathons have you ran?
6, I think.
Right. So like after 6 marathons, right, then it's conditioned, right? Yeah. Your next marathon, it's like, you don't even have to, you just know it's tethered, right? So when you hit that, you're like, right, here comes the sports psychologist. So segmenting, I think your way, and I'm gonna suggest that to people, is brilliant. That's perfect example of segmenting. It can be something as very simple, right? Which is like, oh, I'm just running to that tree.
Yes.
Right. Like that's as simple. I'm just running to that tree. And the reason that the simpler, I think, the better, because a lot of times, as I said, it's about action. So if you get too wrapped up in thought, sometimes, especially as someone who's running their second marathon or their first, it's really like you just want to have something that's really, really simple, that lacks no clarity, that doesn't require a lot of mental practice, right? if you're trying to beat your time, then you can go sophisticated. The other thing is to think about different ways you can segment. So segmenting, the most traditional way is the way you talked about or I talked about, but there's also other ways to kind of segment your experience. So one of the things I talk about in segmenting also is, especially for someone running a marathon, is segmenting your body. So one of the issues that sometimes happens for people is that they have something that's uncomfortable. It's very common, obviously, in a marathon, that something is uncomfortable. And so one of the things, the techniques that I found to be really helpful for people is to think of their body as a company, with their brain being their CEO, and then all these other departments. And that you get these messages from these departments, like the marketing department's like, hey, can we have $15 million? Or, the financial department's like, listen, we need to switch some money from here. And that all these messages are being sent to your brain, and it's sent up there to this higher level of consciousness, which is controlling your body. And to really be able to say as a CEO, well, thanks for that information, but unfortunately, we're just going to run to that next tree. So to have a different response rather than to say, oh my God, I feel this way, or this is happening to me, really to think about it as something where your brain can override. I talk a little bit about this in my book. There's an idea, which maybe some of your listeners or perhaps even talked about before, is of this idea of a central governor, right? Mm-hmm. So there's this idea in the brain that we have kind of like when we get to mile, it depends on the person, but somewhere between mile 10 and 22 for most people is, I don't know where you talk about, I think you said 15 to 18 or something like that. But most people between mile 15 and mile 19 start to have this, what we think of as kind of like in your car when the yellow light goes on, and it's like, hey, just so you know, like you're out of gas. But you can certainly look at your car and say, thanks very much, computer, for that information. Yeah. I'm driving on. And so that idea of the central governor, inhibiting it, a lot to me has to do with segmentation. That's kind of what you're doing when you're doing segmentation. You're saying, thanks for the information, but I choose to ignore that now, and we'll focus on this. And that the more you do it, the better you get at it.
So could that be, you said about something feeling uncomfortable. If it is a specific area, let's say someone's hamstring is bothering them while they're running. Could you say, okay, well, my hamstring's a bit tweaky, but I actually feel pretty good. My breathing's all right. My arms are like kind of those departments thing you mentioned, like maybe the marketing department's a bit, pissed off because they didn't get what they wanted, but everyone else is pretty okay. So for now, I'm going to just ride with that. Is that would that be along with
Totally.
That? Okay.
Totally. Right. And even, another way to think about that is, one of the things I like to keep it very simple, right, for people. So one of the things I just say is way more gas in the tank, right? So one of the things to say is something like that. And what that is shorthand for what you just said, right? Because sometimes it's too much to think, too much information. So if you're like, oh, I'm tweaking it, so even just saying to your point, I like what you were saying at this point, I bet you, I don't know, you can tell me, but if you're running, you're not even thinking, okay, now it's time for me to get my sports psychology. Like you just have a shorthand, right? Well, or in your mind.
Yeah, I definitely do. And it's a word or like something I can repeat. Like the one I always use the example is Drew made me strong is my strength one. So that's easy to say. Drew made me strong. Drew made me strong. Drew made me strong. So I can just keep saying that quickly. But yeah, I mean, in my last marathon, I really struggled early on, and it was just segmenting to get to the next Gatorade. So I kept saying Gatorade. And I hate Gatorade, but that was what was getting me through. So yeah,
you think Fader's a funny nickname. My nickname in the NFL was Faderade.
I like that. That's awesome. And I guess that works because we're coming in and saving the day for them. So
totally. It's hydration for the brain.
Yeah. But no, was there anything else to add for that just before we?
No, I like what you said. I think Drew made me strong is a great one because people get mistaken about self-messaging. People think that self-messaging is like, you can do it, right? They think of this kind of really overly simplified kind of positive message. That's not what this is about at all, right? It's really about saying, if I had a coach, my ideal coach with me during the race, running right next to me and saying stuff into my ear, what would they be saying? It's not about saying, because if your coach says, you can do it. After 3 times, you're like, what does that even mean anymore? Yeah. Drew made me strong is awesome because that's a fact. And it's a fact that for you is connected to the sense of self-efficacy and being able to do it. So, it really has, I always talk to athletes about their own kind of BS meter. It has to pass your BS test.
Mm-hmm.
If you like hear it and you feel like that's kind of ridiculous, then don't say it. It doesn't make any sense.
So true. Thank you. That's really helpful. All right. So what about if someone is a few weeks out from the race? Let's say, it's 2 weeks to go, 3 weeks to go, is looking at what they've been doing, looking at what they should be able to do by now, but don't feel like they can. As we mentioned earlier, 26 miles seems like a long way, or 13 miles, 10K seems like a long way. I don't even think I can make it. Like, how am I going to possibly perform at my best? What would you say now?
I think what I would say is what we try to really drill down on in performance psychology is to make a clear, defined distinction between what you actually can control and what you can't control. Mm-hmm. And so to give a specific, in my book, I have an acronym that I call the DOT, right? Which is doing, outcome, and thinking. And what I say is you don't control the outcome, you control what you do and what you think. Another acronym that we use, I really like, that we use in sports in all different contexts, is paying attention to your APE, like the monkey, APE. These are the things that you control. So, and the more that you can go back to this, I think the better off you are in these situations. You control A, your attitude, P, your preparation, and E, your effort. Mm-hmm. So the moment that you find yourself thinking about like what time you're going to run, it's just asking yourself, is this part of my APE? No, absolutely not. Right? Like there's no result. You can't control a result. Mm-hmm. And so to be able to, your brain is going to learn the pattern. So if every time that you think, oh man, I'm like way behind here and things like that, you catch yourself, because you can't stop doing that. You're going to do it. We all do it. That's just part of our human brains. Like I said, it's this random number generator. We're going to do it. Even if you were on time, you start thinking about, well, what if it rains? And what if it's cold? Or what if it's not cold? Or, all these things. What if I take the ferry to Staten Island and this happens? Or I lose my favorite lucky penny? I don't know. So, but what you can do there is you can say, oh, right. I'm doing that thing again. Let me bring my attention back to what I can do to improve my attitude about this. For example, am I thinking, you know what? This is all part of my plan to just experience greatness in my life, or part of being part of this community, or whatever you're trying to focus on. Remember, I was talking about that macro philosophy. Mm-hmm. Or you can just say to yourself, wow, how lucky am I to be able to compete? How lucky am I? I always think about this whenever I'm running. I think like, wow, my legs work. If I started focusing on like, oh my God, I'm not running fast enough, or yesterday I was like, I had this time or whatever, I just said to myself, you know what? I'm so lucky that I get to even think about these things. And it changes my perspective on that time. Yep. And I would argue actually that it makes me better able to let go and to perform at my best than if I just allow myself to perseverate, to go over and over again, ruminate about like something that I don't have control over.
Absolutely agree. Thank you. That's great advice. And definitely it brings back that whole kind of theme that you were talking about at the very beginning, about bringing it back to the joy and why you do this, rather than it being, about the outcome, the finish line kind of thing. All right. What about race week? It's a few days before, feeling tired, feeling sluggish, but excited. What should listeners be doing to kind of keep themselves calm, keep themselves in the moment? I mean, you having worked with runners, you kind of understand that this is quite different to a lot of the ball sports where they kind of need to get in the zone. For runners, if they do that, it's probably going to get you so worked up that you might, be overstimulated because you have to actually hold back for the beginning part of a race. So what would you say to these people nervous before the race?
Well, a couple. Well, okay. I had one thing until now I'm really conscious about listening.
You were thinking about your answer before I finished talking, weren't you?
No, I'm not guilty. Actually, I was thinking about what you were saying as you were talking, but then at the end you said something that changed where I was thinking about, because you dropped something at the end which is really different, which is nervousness.
Okay, well, we'll talk about nervousness in the next point. So whatever you were going to say before, if you remember it about.
Well, don't let me forget, because the nervousness is something different. And the main point I was going to say, as I was listening extremely intently to you, Tina, is that, that what I think about is, what kind of person are you? So yes, it's true. It's 26 miles. You're running a marathon, right? Like, okay. And there are certain commonalities. Most people have kind of mental interference at the same point, that wall that a lot of people talk about, right? So that's true, but it's what kind of person are you? Mm-hmm. And what I mean by that is, what do you experience? And obviously, if you've run a marathon before, you have more data or whatever it is. If you participate in the event that you're participating in, a 5K, 10K, whatever, half marathon, ultra marathon, and I think when you think about, so for you, if you can get more aware by journaling, by reflecting on your experience about what happens to you, then the answer I'm about to give gets much more specific. So I can tell you about certain things that are really helpful for certain people. But what's more important is to get coaching around and self-reflection about what you experience. In other words, what level of physiological arousal is ideal for you. So for me, let me take it out of sports for a second. I give a lot of talks and I do a lot of keynotes to groups and I do a lot of training and I'm speaking to people all the time. I know pretty much exactly where I need to be. And when I get to a talk, if I'm feeling not like that, I have to do something either to ramp myself up or something to calm myself down. And so it's not the uniform advice for everybody. Now, generally speaking, for a marathon, being super, super amped, it's much more of a kind of leveled off feeling. It's not like, it's much, to me, it's much more, when I've coached people, it's much more akin to being kind of like a kicker or a running back than being on a defensive line. You're not trying to like get up a whole bunch of energy and expend it immediately. You're trying to pace yourself and preserve yourself. And so calmness, I think, in some level is important. And so for most marathoners, now I'm just naturally going into the other question you have about nervousness. For most people, though, it is about finding ways to calm down. And I think that, there are two things that I think come to mind that have been the most helpful. One has to do with understanding your physiology and understanding how your body works with regard to what we think of as nervousness or anxiety. I call it physiological arousal, meaning that your sympathetic nervous system is just kicking in and telling you like it's go time. And so the first step to that is understanding that if you start to breathe in a correct way, and by correct, I mean, generally speaking, abdominal diaphragmatic breathing, usually about 3 seconds in, 3 seconds out, and a 2-second pause. Simple as that. There's other techniques like box breathing, but if you're just looking for a simple technique that's helpful, just breathing 3 seconds out, 3 seconds in, 2-second pause. Some people feel that having the exhale being longer is more helpful. Some people feel breathing in through your nose and breathing out through your mouth is helpful. But I think the most powerful part about this is actually slow, rhythmic breaths with your hand on your diaphragm, which if you're listening to this and you just take your fingers and reach them under your ribs, that muscle right there, the diaphragm, which most runners are aware of anyway, just breathing like that. I think that's one of the things that's helpful. And then also going back to the self-messaging, when you feel those feelings of nervousness, you could say, oh my God, I'm nervous. Oh God, like what is happening? Oh, or man, I'm feeling amped. Or you could say, right, this is my body. It's just getting me ready to go. Like this is a helpful thing that's happening. It may feel weird, but if I was, going into battle, this is what my body would do. And I wouldn't even notice it.
Yeah, that's so true. Thank you. That's helpful. And I'm glad you kind of put both pieces together there because I think that linked quite nicely. Okay, so what about in the race? Someone is in a hard patch, thinking about either dropping out or getting, you've mentioned earlier about kind of segmenting it, breaking it down, get to the next tree, get to the next lamppost. But what about if, dropping out is becoming tempting? It's someone really feels like they've just mentally spiraled out of control. Like, I can't do this. This is too hard. What would your advice be there?
I think, the main thing that I would say about that is, I think the place to deal with that is before you run.
Yeah.
What I mean by that is, that's just sort of like I said, it's kind of an outcome variable. Like if you feel those, and I think the best place to work on that is before you run. So I think a lot of people think, I'm not going to even think those thoughts beforehand. I'm not going to touch those thoughts because it's scary to think that. But I think, allowing yourself to think that thought, not practice it, but just know, that thought might come up. And if that thought comes up, this is how I'm going to deal with it. So for example, what I work on with a lot of athletes is performance imagery. So in the simplest form, the way to explain it is that your brain, when you close your eyes and vividly imagine what's going to happen in the race, your brain, to a large extent, doesn't really tell the difference. I mean, obviously, your conscious mind knows, okay, I'm just doing this in my head. but the connections that happen between your mind and your body are pretty strong. And there's a lot of evidence in much more open sports with interactions with others that you can learn skills that you're practicing in your mind. People in endurance sports, I think, don't really realize the value of this because it's much less about reflexive actions to other people. But there are elements of imagery that are really helpful for runners and competitive racers. And that is that you can practice what you just said in your mind. So in other words, you could be closing your eyes and practice and imagining getting to the wall, imagining having those thoughts and practicing in your mind how you're going to use things like segmenting or self-messaging or mindfulness in that moment. So when you get there, it's not like you're trying to figure out what you're going to do. A great friend and mentor to me, this guy, Ken Ravizza, who was a sports psychologist, worked with the Cubs, someone I really admired, really would always talk about the difference in life and in sports in reacting versus responding.
Yes.
If you get to mile 18 and you're for the first time encountering those thoughts and you didn't anticipate it, you're reacting. If you've said to yourself, like, okay, like those thoughts might come up and, when they come up, I'm going to practice this response to those thoughts, then you're responding. And that's all you can ask for yourself is to have the most adaptive response.
Oh, that's so good. That's so good. And definitely, I think I've definitely heard about that reactive versus, was it responsive?
Responding.
Yeah. Before, but I'm sure everyone listening can definitely relate to what you mean by that. And that is so true. All right. Just quickly before we get to the final 4 questions, I want to ask you, someone after the race, it went really well, but now they're feeling a bit lost. They completed their goal, not sure where to go from here. Any advice you would have for kind of the next step?
Well, I'd say enjoy it. I mean, I would say don't fight it. Like, being lost is, I think, a great privilege. It can be really scary, but in my mind, like if I just take a second to think about the times in my life where I was lost, I think in the moment I felt like distress. But if I look back at it, I think like, wow, like that was such a unique time. And I think if you can think of it in that way, it changes the whole idea of being lost, right? I mean, like if you think about being lost, right, what comes to mind? Well, I think of like the horror I feel like if I'm like in the supermarket and I lose my kid for like, even like, 60 seconds. But you could also think about it as like, oh, okay, lost is also like, you go to work and, it's shut down for some weird reason. And then like you have the whole day to wander around, or, you're in a foreign country and you're just looking around. So I would say like, what if you just had a level of curiosity, orientation towards your lostness rather than a punishing or, so you just said, oh, this is really curious. Like, this is an interesting time. I don't know where I'm at. That's one. And 2 is, to use your specific example, I think one of the things that people don't do enough is when they have success, they don't examine it. When we have failure, like we're like really digging down to like, oh, why did I fail? And this is where my transitions, and I should have put on my sneakers. Like, you're going into that. But when we have success, like we don't spend enough time thinking, cool. And so I think if you're lost after your race that you did well in, spend some time thinking about like what went well. And that may be a path to find some level of kind of an interesting way forward. Yeah,
so true. And I think you're exactly right there with not spending enough time kind of seeing, what did I do right? Why did it go right? What did I do? So thank you. That's great to reflect. All right. I have 4 more short questions for you, starting with one piece of advice you would like to give the listeners for life.
One piece of advice that I'd like to give listeners for life. I guess, one of the things I think about, I'll tell you like my favorite quote, and I'll tell you sort of, I don't know if it's advice, but it's sort of how I live, and so far, so good, is we act as though comfort and luxury are the most important things in life, but all we really need is something to be enthusiastic about.
That's good.
And that's Albert Einstein. And so, I don't know if I could say it's advice, but I can tell you that, for me, finding ways to be enthusiastic about things has led to tremendous opportunity and tremendous joy in my life.
And being okay with it kind of transitioning at times, because sometimes we can feel like you're kind of pigeonholed in one area and then you have to stick with it. But sometimes you might get that enthusiasm for something else. So kind of go with it. So
Totally. I mean, you always have a choice.
Yeah.
And we always have a choice how we're going to view these moments.
I
And
love that.
if you can find enthusiasm, I mean, even in like moments where you're feeling tense, to be able to say, oh, okay, this is interesting. I'm going to find a way to be enthusiastic about that or interested or curious.
That's good. Thank you so much. All right. One person to follow on social media and why? And you're not allowed to say Guy Winch.
Okay. I won't say Guy Winch. Guy Winch. No. I mean, my friend Ryan Holiday is a tremendous writer and thinker. I mean, he's wrote a couple of books that I really like.
Is it Ask?
The Obstacle is the Way.
No, okay.
The Obstacle is the Way, and Ego's Enemy. I think he's really into Stoicism and has great quotes from Epictetus and all these interesting Stoics. And I think they're helpful from an athletic perspective.
Okay, and is that holiday spelled the normal way, or is it with an A? Holiday.
Jeez, like one thing. I think it's AY, but I mean, I'm terrible with that stuff.
Okay, all right. Well, I'll have it in the show notes for everyone to.
If you put in Ryan Holiday, you'll find it for sure.
Okay, all right. I will put it in the show notes, and I will also put Guy Winch. And I'm not saying anything against Guy Winch, but he's the one that introduced me to Fader. So I didn't want him to take the easy way out.
Fader. There you go. You're getting used to it.
That felt a bit more natural. All right. How do you want to be remembered on this show?
On this show. Well, I mean, I'll go back to how I want to be remembered, and then I'll go to this show. I want to be remembered as someone who's kind and generous. So I hope that there's something that I hope if you're listening that you got something out of this, and that you'll be able to also pass that on to someone else.
Absolutely agree with that. And it's funny you said that, because the question was originally, how do you want to be remembered? But I felt like people were saying that I was like thinking very morbidly about them, like what would they want to be, put on their tombstone kind of thing. And I was like, I'm not trying to say that. I'm trying to say like, yeah, what do you want to be? I want to be remembered as a good person kind of thing. So it's funny you answered it the way it's supposed to be answered.
Oh, good.
And finally, what do you tell yourself when you're on, if you've done any racing, the start line of a race, or before you give a presentation or a talk, what do you tell yourself?
A lot of times I tell myself, be where your feet are. A lot of times I tell myself, pressure is a privilege. A lot of times I tell myself, you're so lucky to be here right now. I say weird stuff to myself. Sometimes I say, you could be a bug. No offense if you're a bug listening to this.
That is very random. Just because but you're a human being.
The idea of be a human. To be a human is such a gift. I mean, I feel like it comes, don't get me wrong, it comes with some awkward moments. At least for me. I don't know about you guys, but for me, definitely. But it's just a gift. So I think of ways to be grateful for that all the time. And it helps me, I think, if not perform better, then at least have a better time performing.
Thank you so much. And finally, do you have a book coming out in a few months? If that is available for pre-order, tell us about that. If not, you can tell us where we can find you, and your book, Life as Sport, you mentioned in the show, where people can find that as well.
Well, I have a book coming out in the fall called Coaching Athletes to Be Their Best, Motivational Interviewing in Sport. And it's all about what you were saying before. It's all about how to listen to people that you're coaching, and has applications to effective listening and communication in a wide array of scenarios. And you can certainly find me at jonathanfader.com and follow me on Twitter at DRFADER, at Dr. Fader.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for your wisdom. This has been a wonderful conversation, and I truly appreciate you. Thanks for all that you do to help, not only giving your time for us, but all the people that you help in this world. I know you make this world a better place. So thank you so much.
I appreciate it, and I appreciate how well you listened, and I enjoyed listening to your excellent questions. I always learn a lot when I talk to people who are deep in their field. So thanks so much, Tina.
Thank you. My friends, if you have a minute and you could leave a review on your favorite podcast player, Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Stitcher, Overcast, Pocket Cast, Spotify, or whatever else podcast player you use to listen to this podcast, or if you would subscribe to this podcast, you will help me get out in front of new runners to make our tribe even bigger and even better. It might not seem like you as one person can make a difference, but really it helps a lot. And it shows me you appreciate the hard work I put in for those. Thank you so much. And that's a wrap. All 7 of our experts have shared their advice and helped us through our mental training. Now you have a lot of strategies and tools to go try in your next racing segment. So I better not hear from anyone that they don't know how to work on their mental toughness or that they're too nervous on race morning. Instead, I want you to share with me on social media which of these methods you do try. Tag me in them. Let me know whose advice is working. I really am curious. If you love the mental side of things, I'm working on a mental training course that brings together all the knowledge I've learned from these experts and many more in my running to give you everything in one place. It will be launching in September 2019. But if you want to be a part of the beta group who get to see it before anyone else, which you can, I have a limited number of spots available. Send me an email, tina@tinamuir.com, and I will put you in that group. Thank you to Fader. That still sounds weird, me saying that. I don't know why I've always had a problem with that, but it just doesn't feel right. Anyone else or just me? I loved his advice and I loved learning from all the experts this week. I hope you enjoyed it. And now you have just 4 more days until the next episode comes out on Friday with my husband, Steve. I will be answering your questions on the show and just having a bit more of a relaxed episode. We're just going to have a bit of a conversation, a bit of an update, and just kind of, hearing what you wanted to know about us. You can find links to everything Jonathan and I talked about today at tinamuir.com/episode 124. And thank you again to Body Health and Generation UCAN for supporting the show. See you Friday.
Thanks for listening to the Running for Real podcast. Be sure to check out tinamuir.com for show notes and even more helpful running information.